I went to my beach house to relax after months of exhaustion, but when I turned onto the familiar sandy road, the sound I heard wasn't the ocean, it was jackhammers. The front porch where my husband and I used to watch the sunrise was covered with lumber and broken shingles. The windows were wrapped in plastic. Half the roof was missing. The kitchen walls had already been torn open, and strangers in hard hats walked through my home as if I had stopped existing. I stood there gripping my car keys while dust drifted through the salty air. Then my daughter-in-law stepped out onto the porch, brushed drywall powder from her sweater, smiled as if she were greeting a neighbor, and said, "Perfect timing. We were just talking about where your furniture should go." I looked at her without saying a word. My son came out behind her, carrying a roll of blueprints under his arm. "Mom," he sighed, "don't make this harder than it has to be." I slowly looked from his face to the workers hauling my kitchen cabinets into a dumpster. "Who gave permission for this?" I asked quietly. Emily folded her arms and laughed. "We decided to renovate before moving in. It only makes sense." I remember staring at the pieces of my old oak cabinets lying in the yard, cabinets my late husband had built with his own hands almost 30 years earlier. Nobody asked me. Nobody even called me. They had already decided my future while I was still alive. If this story truly resonates with you, I'd love for you to let me know where you're watching from by sharing your city or country along with your local time. It always amazes me to see how many people around the world understand what it feels like when family quietly forgets where the boundaries should have been. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 69 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. The beach house on Hilton Head Island wasn't the biggest property I'd ever owned, and it certainly wasn't the most expensive thing my husband and I ever worked for. But it carried something money could never replace. Every weathered board, every faded photograph, every seashell resting on the windowsill held pieces of a life we had built together before cancer took Arthur away 9 years earlier. Whenever the world became too loud, I drove there. That house always reminded me who I had been before grief became part of my daily routine. The morning I arrived, all I wanted was 2 quiet weeks. I had packed my favorite coffee mug, 3 mystery novels, and the knitted blanket my sister made years ago. I imagined opening every window and falling asleep to the sound of waves rolling onto the shore. Instead, I stepped into what looked like the middle of someone else's construction project. One worker carried my dining room chairs across the driveway. Another measured the living room walls while speaking into a headset. A young electrician nodded politely as he walked past me. "Morning, Mrs. Collins," he said. "We're making good progress." I blinked. Progress on what? He hesitated for only a second before pointing toward the kitchen. "The full renovation your family approved." My family approved. Not me. My family. Those words echoed louder than the machinery. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did whenever he wanted to avoid conflict. "Mom," he said softly, "Emily has some wonderful ideas. The place needed updating anyway." I looked at him carefully. Needed updating for whom? Neither of them answered immediately. Emily walked farther into the living room and unfolded a glossy catalog across the dusty countertop that no longer had cabinets beneath it. "We're opening up the whole floor plan," she said cheerfully. "The guest rooms will become the kids' rooms, and we're putting in a much bigger kitchen island. It'll finally feel like a real family home." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not panic, something quieter, something colder. They weren't talking about borrowing the house for weekends anymore. They were talking about living there, permanently. As if the decision had already been made months ago, without me ever being part of the conversation. I slowly walked toward the back porch, where the ocean stretched across the horizon exactly as it always had. The waves hadn't changed. The breeze still carried the same salt air Arthur used to love, but everything between me and that water suddenly felt unfamiliar. Behind me, I heard Emily laughing with one of the contractors. Daniel joined them, discussing paint colors and flooring samples, as though I were simply another visitor passing through. None of them noticed that I wasn't looking at the walls anymore. My eyes had settled on a clipboard lying near the sliding glass door. Across the top was a stack of renovation permits, invoices, and printed approvals. My own name appeared neatly typed beneath several authorization forms. Then I noticed something else. At the bottom of the last page was an email address that looked exactly like mine, except for a single extra letter that almost nobody would ever notice. I picked up the clipboard without saying anything. My fingers rested on the edge of the paper, but my mind had already drifted somewhere else, somewhere much quieter than the sound of drills echoing through my beach house. Looking at those forged approvals reminded me that this morning had not appeared out of nowhere. Families rarely fall apart in a single afternoon. Most of the time, it happens one small moment at a time, almost too quietly to notice, until one day you realize you have become a guest in your own life. Arthur used to tell me, "Pay attention to the little things, Maggie. The big things always start there." Back then, I thought he was talking about maintaining a house. I did not realize he was talking about people. After Arthur passed away, Daniel changed. Not overnight. Grief does not only visit widows, it visits children too. He became quieter, more eager to avoid disagreements. When Emily entered his life a couple of years later, I was genuinely happy for him. She was intelligent, organized, and full of energy. During our first Thanksgiving together, she hugged me before dinner and said, "I have always wanted a close family." I believed her. I truly did. The first few years felt normal. We spent holidays together. We took walks on the beach. Emily even asked me for recipes that Arthur loved. "Daniel says your crab cakes are impossible to beat." She laughed one afternoon while writing notes on a yellow legal pad. I smiled. "Your own recipe will eventually become better than mine." She looked up and answered, "Only if you promise to keep teaching me." Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether she meant those words or simply knew they were exactly what I wanted to hear. Things changed so gradually that I kept finding excuses for every uncomfortable moment. Emily began making decisions before asking questions. She rearranged my Charleston kitchen while visiting because, as she put it, "This layout makes more sense." She replaced family photographs with modern picture frames because she thought they looked cleaner. One afternoon, I walked into my own dining room and found my grandmother's antique lamp sitting in a cardboard box. "I was just helping you declutter," she said casually. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "Mom, she is only trying to help." I remember forcing a smile. Of course. It seemed easier than explaining why every object carried a memory that no one else could see. The beach house slowly became another subject of conversation. At first, it sounded harmless. "You should let us spend more weekends there," Emily suggested during one family dinner. "The kids would love growing up around the ocean." I nodded. "You are always welcome when you ask." She laughed lightly. "You are so formal, Margaret. We are family." Family. It became her favorite word whenever she wanted something. Family should not need permission. Family should share. Family helps family. Each sentence sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they slowly erased the boundaries I had spent a lifetime respecting. Daniel rarely challenged her. If I looked at him after one of those comments, he would simply offer an apologetic smile. "Emily does not mean anything by it, Mom." I wanted to believe him because believing him hurt less than admitting the truth. Last summer, we were sitting on the back deck watching the sunset paint the water orange and gold. Emily looked around the property with unusual excitement. "This place has incredible potential," she said. Imagine opening up the walls, replacing the old floors, adding bigger windows. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. Arthur designed most of this himself. She shrugged. Times change. Daniel stared toward the water without saying anything. That silence stayed with me much longer than her words. A few months later, Emily called while I was planting roses outside my townhouse. "Margaret," she said cheerfully, "can you send me the measurements for the upstairs bedrooms?" I paused. "Why would you need those?" "Oh, I was just curious." I gave her the measurements because it seemed harmless. Looking back now, I realized how many harmless questions eventually became permanent assumptions. Standing inside the dusty shell of my beach house, I finally understood that they had not simply imagined living here. They had been planning it for a very long time. The walls being torn apart were only the visible part of something much older. My attention returned to the clipboard in my hands. I carefully studied the printed approvals one more time. Every signature looked convincing. Every document appeared professionally prepared. Then I noticed a handwritten note clipped to the back of the file. It read, "Final payment due upon owner inspection scheduled for Friday." Today was Friday. I slipped the clipboard back onto the temporary work table exactly where I had found it. No one noticed. The workers were busy measuring walls and carrying stacks of lumber through what used to be my living room. It struck me how easy it is for people to stop seeing the owner once they become convinced they already own the future. Emily walked over with a confident smile that seemed completely untouched by doubt. "You are awfully quiet," she said. "I figured you would be excited once you saw the plans." I looked at her. I never approved any plans. She let out a small laugh as though I had missed the obvious. "You would have eventually. We were only saving everyone time." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Mom, the house needed work. We talked about it." I kept my voice calm. "No, Daniel, you talked about it." Talking is not the same as asking. For a brief second, neither of them answered. Then Emily turned toward the kitchen and motioned for me to follow her. "Come here. Let me show you something." I stepped carefully around exposed pipes and broken drywall until we reached what had once been Arthur's favorite room. The old breakfast nook was gone. The built-in shelves he had installed himself had already been ripped out. The bay window where we watched storms roll across the Atlantic now overlooked piles of broken cabinets stacked like discarded memories. Emily spread out another set of drawings across a folding table. "This will all be open concept," she explained. "The kitchen island will be twice as large, and we are removing that old hallway completely. Nobody designs houses like that anymore." I rested my hand on the edge of the table. "Arthur built that hallway." She shrugged. "Well, Arthur is not living here anymore." The words landed quietly, but they cut deeper than she could have known. Daniel immediately looked at her. "Emily." She waved him off. "What?" "I am talking about the house, not trying to hurt anybody." I looked at the empty space where Arthur had once marked our children's heights, with pencil lines every birthday. The entire section of wall had already been demolished. Nobody else even knew those marks had existed. They were gone before I had the chance to say goodbye to them. I felt my throat tighten, but I refused to let my voice shake. "Did either of you think to ask whether there was anything in this house worth preserving?" Emily folded her arms. "Margaret, memories are not walls. You can carry memories anywhere." I nodded slowly. "That is easy to say when they are not your memories?" She sighed with visible impatience. "You are looking backward. Daniel and I are building something for the future." Building. The word echoed through the room, while another cabinet crashed into the construction dumpster outside. I turned toward my son. "When exactly did this become your future?" He hesitated before answering. "We assumed." I gently interrupted him. "Assumed what?" His eyes dropped to the floor. Emily answered instead, that eventually this house would stay in the family. We are family. I looked directly at her. Staying in the family and taking it before I choose to leave it are two very different things. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had arrived, I saw the smallest flicker of irritation replace her confidence. One of the carpenters approached carrying a bundle of electrical plans. Mrs. Pans. "Collins," he said politely, "where would you like the charging station installed in the primary suite?" Before I could answer, Emily stepped forward. "Put it by the east wall like we discussed." The carpenter glanced back and forth between us. I just wanted the owner's confirmation. Emily smiled without missing a beat. "I handle all of that for Margaret." I watched the young man nod and walk away. She had answered so naturally that even strangers believed she spoke for me. That realization hurt more than any argument could have. It meant this had been happening long enough for everyone involved to accept it as normal. I slowly walked into what had once been Arthur's study. The door had been removed. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, each marked with thick black letters. Donate. Storage. Disposal. I opened one box and immediately recognized Arthur's handwritten journals, our family photo albums, and the brass compass his father had carried during the Korean War. Mixed together. Unprotected. Waiting to be hauled away with everything else. "Those are not trash," I said quietly. Emily called from the hallway. "The designer said most of that old stuff just creates clutter." I carefully lifted the compass into my hand. Arthur used to polish it every Memorial Day before placing it back on the bookshelf. As I turned it over, something folded inside the leather case slipped onto the dusty floor. It was not one of Arthur's notes. It was a crisp business card tucked behind the lining, and written across the back in fresh blue ink were 6 words that made my heart stop. "Ask Laura before signing anything. Urgent." For a long moment, I simply stared at the words written on the back of the business card. The handwriting was familiar. Arthur's letters always leaned slightly to the right, neat and steady, just like the man himself. "Ask Laura before signing anything. Urgent." I turned the card over. The front read, "Laura Bennett, Bennett and Pierce, Real Estate Law, Savannah, Georgia." My heart began beating a little faster, not because I understood what it meant, but because Arthur had never left random notes. If he wrote something down, he had a reason. I slipped the card into my jacket pocket before anyone noticed. "Margaret?" Daniel called from the hallway. "Are you coming?" I looked back once before leaving the study. The empty shelves, the dust floating through the afternoon light, and the missing pieces of our life all seemed strangely quiet now. It was as though the house itself had been waiting for me to find that card. I joined the others in what used to be the living room. Workers continued moving around us, measuring walls and discussing electrical outlets. One man stood apart from the rest, studying a stack of permits with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and sun-weathered skin that suggested decades spent working outdoors. As I approached, he glanced up, froze for a second, then lowered the paperwork. "Mrs. Collins?" he asked carefully. I nodded. "Yes." His expression softened immediately. "I thought I recognized you." "Robert Hayes." He extended his hand. "We met years ago. My wife and I bought our first home through Bennett and Pierce. Arthur introduced us after helping me settle a property dispute." I shook his hand politely, trying to remember. Then I saw it. The smile, the voice. "You were a Coast Guard captain," I said. His face brightened. "Retired now. Construction keeps me busy these days." Emily walked over before another word could be exchanged. "Robert, everything is going according to schedule, right?" He nodded automatically but kept looking at me. "Mrs. Collins, I had no idea you were coming today. I expected to meet you during the final inspection. I felt the room grow quieter around us. Final inspection? I repeated. That is what the paperwork says. Emily stepped closer. Robert, we already explained everything. He frowned slightly. I am sorry. I thought everyone was on the same page. I looked directly at him. May I ask you something? Of course. Have you ever spoken with me? His forehead tightened. Not in person. Over the telephone? No. Did you ever receive a signed letter from me? No. Emily interrupted before he could continue. Robert, this is becoming unnecessary. He turned toward her, clearly confused by the tension in the room. I calmly asked one more question. Then how exactly were these renovations authorized? Robert looked down at the folder in his hands. Everything came through email. Detailed approvals, material selections, budget increases. We received responses almost every step of the way. Daniel's face slowly lost its color. Emily crossed her arms but remained silent. Robert looked from one of us to the other. Was there some misunderstanding? I reached into my pocket and removed the folded business card Arthur had hidden years earlier. Do you know Laura Bennett? His eyes widened immediately. Know her? Absolutely. She has represented property owners across coastal South Carolina and Georgia for decades. She is one of the most respected real estate attorneys around here. He paused, studying me more closely. Arthur trusted her completely. My fingers tightened around the card. Apparently he wanted me to trust her too. Robert nodded slowly, almost to himself. That sounds exactly like Arthur. For the first time since I had arrived, I noticed uncertainty spreading across the faces of the workers nearby. Conversations became quieter. Tape measures stopped clicking. Even the electrician who had greeted me earlier seemed to sense something had shifted. Robert cleared his throat. Mrs. Collins, I hope you do not mind me asking, but are you saying you never approved this project? I met his eyes without raising my voice. I am saying I have never seen these plans until today. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of every machine outside. Robert slowly opened the permit folder again, carefully flipping through the printed approvals. His confident expression disappeared page by page. Finally, he stopped on one document and looked back at me. There is something here that suddenly does not make sense. What is it? I asked. He held up a single page for me to see. The very first authorization was not signed with your legal name. It was signed with a version of your name that only someone very close to you would think to use. And according to this timestamp, he looked up, his voice quieter than before. The approval was supposedly sent while records show the property owner was over 2,000 miles away on a charity trip in Arizona. Robert kept staring at the document as though he hoped it would suddenly explain itself. Around us, the rhythm of the construction site had slowed to an uneasy murmur. The workers were still moving, but with the cautious pace of people who sensed they had wandered into a conversation that mattered far more than lumber and drywall. Daniel finally broke the silence. Mom, what charity trip? I turned toward him. The one I told you about 3 times before I left. His eyebrows pulled together. I thought that was only a weekend. It became almost 2 weeks after the Coastal Relief Organization asked me to stay. Robert looked at me with new interest. You volunteer with Coastal Relief Alliance? I nodded. For the past 11 years, he let out a slow breath. I served on their advisory board after I retired from the Coast Guard. Arthur never mentioned that you eventually joined. I smiled faintly. Arthur believed good work did not need an audience. Robert lowered his eyes for a moment, almost in respect. That sounds exactly like him. Emily shifted impatiently. I really do not see why any of this matters. Margaret wanted the house updated. Everyone knew that. I looked at her calmly. No, Emily, you wanted the house updated. She folded her arms tighter. You always talked about how exhausting it was to maintain this place. Being tired is not the same as giving something away. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Can we please stop arguing? Robert answered before I could. This is not an argument anymore. If the approvals are inaccurate, we have a legal problem. Those words settled heavily over the room. Emily tried to laugh them away. Legal problem? Come on, Robert. It is a family misunderstanding. He did not smile back. Ma'am, construction companies depend on valid authorization. We cannot simply assume ownership because relatives tell us everything is fine. I watched Daniel glance uneasily between Robert and me. For the first time all day, uncertainty had replaced confidence in his eyes. He looked less like a man defending a decision and more like a son realizing he had never asked enough questions. Robert carefully closed the folder. Mrs. Collins, may I ask something personal? Of course. Arthur always struck me as someone who planned well ahead. Did the two of you ever create a trust or estate plan? Emily answered before I could. Daniel is the only child. Everything naturally stays with him. Robert slowly turned toward her. That is not necessarily how property law works. I reached into my purse and removed an old leather checkbook cover. Tucked inside was a folded receipt from years ago. As I unfolded it, a small brass key slipped into my palm. Daniel looked at it with surprise. I have never seen that before. You were never meant to, I replied gently. I turned the key over between my fingers. Arthur had handed it to me the winter before he passed away. We had been sitting on this very porch wrapped in blankets while a cold Atlantic wind rattled the shutters. He had closed my hand around the key and smiled. Promise me something, Maggie. Anything. Do not let people confuse kindness with surrender. I remembered laughing because the sentence had sounded so unlike him. Arthur rarely spoke in dramatic ways. Why would anyone do that? I had asked. He looked toward the ocean before answering. Because generous people often become invisible to those who only notice what they can take. I had kept the key ever since, even though I rarely thought about it. Robert noticed the worn edges immediately. Safety deposit box? He asked quietly. I nodded once. Savannah First National Bank. Emily looked confused. Why would Arthur keep a safety deposit box there? Because that is where Bennett and Pierce handled several closings years ago. Robert answered before I could. Many clients stored original legal documents nearby. Emily's expression changed almost imperceptibly. It was the first genuine uncertainty I had seen from her all day. Daniel looked at me. Mom, what documents? I hesitated. Not because I wanted to hide the truth from him forever, but because I suddenly realized how little he actually knew about the life his father and I had built before he was old enough to remember mortgages, legal papers, or business decisions. Arthur and I had always protected our children from those burdens. Perhaps we had protected them too well. My telephone vibrated inside my purse. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in years. Laura Bennett. I answered softly. Hello, Laura. Her voice remained calm and professional. Margaret, I received your message from my assistant. Please tell me you have not signed anything today. I have not. There was a brief pause before she spoke again. Good. Then there is still time. I found Arthur's original file this morning, and there is one document inside that no one except you has ever seen. You need to come here immediately because if what you described is true, everyone has been making assumptions about ownership that are completely wrong. Laura's words stayed with me long after the call ended. I slipped my telephone back into my purse and looked around the room. Nothing had changed physically. The walls were still open. The floors were still covered in dust. The workers still stood waiting for instructions. Yet somehow, the entire atmosphere felt different. The confidence that had filled the house only an hour earlier had quietly disappeared. Robert Hayes was the first to speak. "Mrs. Collins, I think we should pause today's work until this is sorted out." Emily immediately stepped forward. "Pause? Absolutely not. We have subcontractors scheduled all week." Robert met her eyes with the calm patience of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. "Ma'am, if there is a legitimate question about authorization, I cannot responsibly continue demolition." "There is no question," Emily replied. "Everything was approved." I answered softly before Robert could. "Then proving that should not be difficult." She looked at me, searching my face for anger, but she found none. I was simply tired of assumptions replacing facts. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all day. "Mom, why did that attorney sound so certain?" I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because your father believed that important promises should be written down, not left to memory." He lowered his eyes. I could almost see him trying to remember conversations he had never fully listened to. Arthur had always handled paperwork himself. Daniel had grown up believing legal documents were simply another stack of papers adults worried about. He had never understood how carefully his father planned for the future. Robert opened the permit folder once more and slowly arranged several pages across the temporary work table. "There is another problem," he said. "These email approvals came from the same address every time, but the metadata attached to the last message shows a different internet location than the previous ones." Emily shook her head impatiently. "I do not even know what that means," Robert replied evenly. "It means someone may not have been sending messages from where they claim to be." Silence settled over the room again. The electrician removed his hard hat and quietly walked outside. Two carpenters exchanged uncertain glances before setting down their tools. No one wanted to become part of a dispute involving property ownership. I noticed Carlos Ramirez, the site supervisor, approaching from the driveway carrying a binder under one arm. He had been inspecting material deliveries near the garage all morning. "Robert," he called. "The flooring shipment just arrived." Then he noticed everyone standing motionless. "Did I interrupt something?" Robert gestured toward me. "Carlos, this is Mrs. Margaret Collins." Carlos smiled politely before his expression suddenly changed. "Mrs. Collins?" he repeated. "The Margaret Collins?" I nodded, surprised by the question. He looked almost embarrassed. "I am sorry. I did not realize you were the owner," Emily answered quickly. "She is. We are handling everything together." Carlos did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Several months ago, I tried calling the owner because one of the cabinet dimensions did not match the plans." My attention sharpened. "You called?" "Yes, ma'am. I never received a call." He frowned. "Someone answered your listed contact number and told me never to bother you with construction details because your daughter-in-law had complete authority." Emily's shoulders stiffened. "Carlos, we already discussed this." He looked genuinely confused. "I thought we had." Daniel slowly turned toward his wife. "Emily, what number did they call?" She hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "The number on the paperwork." Robert immediately flipped through the file until he found the contact sheet. He slid it across the table toward me. I studied it carefully. The telephone number printed beneath my name looked familiar at first glance. Then I realized why. Every digit matched mine except one. A single number had been changed. Anyone reading quickly would never notice the difference. Robert exhaled slowly. "That explains why Mrs. Collins never received our messages." Daniel stared at the page in disbelief. "Emily, "Did you know about this?" She looked at him with wide eyes. "Of course not. Maybe somebody at the office made a mistake." Carlos quietly shook his head. The contact sheet was updated twice during the project. Both revisions came from the same email address that approved the renovations. No one spoke. The only sound came from the ocean beyond the open walls, steady and unchanged. I reached into my purse and took out Arthur's brass key once more, letting it rest quietly in my palm. I thought about all the years he had spent preparing for possibilities I never imagined would matter. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was a little boy. It was not confidence. It was uncertainty. "Mom," he said softly, "what exactly did Dad leave behind?" Before I could answer, another vehicle pulled slowly into the driveway. A dark blue sedan stopped beside the construction trailers. The driver's door opened, and Laura Bennett stepped out, carrying a weathered leather briefcase and a long, sealed document tube. She looked toward the house, saw me standing in the doorway, and raised the tube slightly before calling out in a clear, steady voice. "Margaret, I brought the original deed, and there is something else inside these records that no one has opened since Arthur signed them 9 years ago." Laura walked up the front steps with the same steady confidence I remembered from years ago. Time had added silver to her hair, but it had not changed the way she carried herself. She greeted me with a warm smile before looking around at the exposed walls and scattered construction materials. "I was afraid I might be too late," she said quietly. "You are right on time," I answered. She nodded once and placed the weathered leather briefcase on the folding table beside the permit folder. Then she carefully laid the sealed document tube next to it. Every conversation in the house faded. Even the workers standing outside seemed to sense that something important was about to happen. Laura looked toward Robert Hayes first. "Robert, it has been a long time." He smiled politely. "Too long. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." She glanced at the permit packet already spread across the table. "I understand there are questions about authorization." Robert answered honestly. "There are more than questions now." Emily stepped forward before anyone else could continue. "With all due respect, this is still a family matter." Laura met her eyes without raising her voice. Family matters often become legal matters when contracts, property rights, and signatures are involved. Emily folded her arms. Nobody was trying to steal anything. I remained silent. There was no reason to argue. Facts have a way of speaking more clearly than wounded emotions. Laura slowly opened her briefcase and removed several neatly organized folders. Each one carried Arthur's name in his familiar handwriting. Seeing it again tightened something inside my chest. Daniel stared at the folders with quiet disbelief. "Dad kept all of that?" Laura smiled gently. "Your father kept everything." She opened the first folder and carefully placed a certified copy of the deed on the table. Robert leaned forward immediately. Carlos stepped closer from behind him. Daniel instinctively looked over their shoulders. Emily remained where she was, but I noticed the confidence in her posture beginning to fade. Laura rested one finger on the deed. "The ownership is very clear. Margaret Collins is the sole legal owner of this property." Robert nodded almost immediately. "That matches the county records we verified this afternoon." Emily quickly replied, "Well, eventually Daniel inherits it anyway." Laura looked at her with professional calm. "Eventually is not today." Nobody answered. Laura continued, "Ownership today determines who has authority today." Robert slowly closed the permit folder, "which means every authorization should have come directly from Mrs. Collins." "Correct," Laura replied. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face. "I never asked to see any of these papers." His voice sounded more disappointed in himself than anyone else. Emily turned toward him. "Daniel, we were trying to make things easier." He looked at her for several long seconds before speaking. Were we? The question hung in the air without an answer. Laura reached into the briefcase again and removed another envelope sealed with Arthur's signature across the flap. This remained unopened because Arthur specifically instructed that only Margaret could decide when it should be reviewed. I looked at the envelope, but did not reach for it yet. My fingers were suddenly unsteady. Laura smiled kindly. "Take your time." I nodded. Arthur always believed rushing important decisions created unnecessary mistakes. Robert quietly chuckled. "That sounds familiar." The workers nearby exchanged glances, but respectfully stayed silent. No one seemed interested in construction anymore. The house had become something entirely different. It had become a place where years of assumptions were quietly unraveling. Emily finally broke the silence again. "None of this changes the fact that we invested money into this renovation." Robert answered before anyone else could. "Actually, it changes quite a bit." She turned toward him. "What is that supposed to mean?" He spoke carefully, choosing every word. "Construction contracts depend upon valid authority. If the approvals are invalid, the financial responsibilities become much more complicated." Carlos added gently, "That is why we always document every communication." Emily looked frustrated. "So now everyone suddenly believes I planned this?" Carlos shook his head. "I am not deciding what happened. I am only explaining what our records show." Daniel slowly walked toward one of the broken windows overlooking the ocean. He stood there quietly for almost a minute before speaking without turning around. "Mom, why did you never tell me how much Dad organized?" I smiled sadly. "Because your father never wanted our children to measure love by paperwork." Daniel lowered his head. "Maybe we should have." Those words seemed to reach Emily more deeply than anything else had that afternoon. She opened her mouth to respond but stopped herself. For the first time since I arrived, she looked uncertain, not because someone challenged her, but because Daniel no longer echoed her certainty. Laura finally handed me the sealed envelope. The paper felt surprisingly heavy in my hands. Arthur's signature stretched neatly across the flap, unchanged after all these years. Beneath it, in smaller handwriting, he had added one final sentence meant only for me. "If this envelope is ever opened because someone forgets who Margaret truly is, then it is time for them to learn the whole story." I carefully broke the seal. Inside lay several folded documents, and a handwritten letter addressed not to me, but to Daniel. My hands trembled only slightly as I unfolded the letter. Arthur's handwriting immediately brought back memories of quiet Sunday mornings, when he would sit by the kitchen window with a cup of black coffee, writing notes with the same careful patience he brought to everything else in life. I looked at Daniel before speaking. "This was written for you." His eyes met mine with uncertainty. "You should read it," he whispered. I nodded and began reading aloud. "Dear Daniel, if you are hearing these words, then something has happened that I prayed never would. Your mother has always been the strongest person I have ever known, but strength often hides behind kindness. I hope you never mistake one for the other. This house belongs to Margaret because it was never simply an investment. It became her anchor long before it became anyone else's inheritance. If you ever face a choice between convenience and honoring her wishes, choose her. You will never regret respecting the woman who spent her entire life protecting you." I stopped for a moment, unable to continue until I had taken a slow breath. The room had become completely still. Even the sounds from outside seemed farther away. Daniel stared at the floor. His face carried the weight of memories that were finally rearranging themselves into something he had never expected to see. I continued reading. "Do not allow anyone, including yourself, to decide that love gives permission to ignore boundaries. Ownership is responsibility before it is privilege. If Margaret chooses one day to give you this home, receive it with gratitude. If she chooses to keep it until her last day, honor that choice without resentment. A gift forced before its time is no gift at all. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel slowly walked toward me. His eyes were filled with quiet regret. "Mom," he said softly, "I failed him." I gently shook my head. "You lost your way. That is not the same thing." Emily looked from Daniel to me, her confidence completely gone. "Daniel, I never wanted this to happen." He turned toward her, his voice calm but heavy. "Maybe not. But every time Mom hesitated, we treated it like an obstacle instead of listening." She swallowed hard. "I thought we were building a future. You started building it before asking whether it belonged to us." Robert quietly closed the permit folder. "Mrs. Collins, I have already instructed every crew to stop work immediately." Carlos nodded. "The equipment will be removed before sunset." Robert continued. "Our attorneys will review the authorization records. We also have an obligation to preserve every email, revision, invoice, and communication connected to this project." Emily lowered herself onto one of the folding chairs, as though the strength had quietly left her legs. She looked around at the unfinished rooms that only hours earlier had seemed so full of promise. Now they felt empty. Not because the walls were missing, but because trust was. Laura gently placed another folder beside me. "Margaret, the county recorder will receive updated documentation confirming that no ownership transfer has ever occurred. The construction contracts will be addressed through the proper legal process." I nodded. "Thank you." There was no satisfaction in hearing those words. Only relief that the truth no longer needed anyone to defend it. It could finally stand on its own. Daniel looked toward the ocean through the open wall where Arthur's favorite window had once been. I kept telling myself, "This was only a renovation," he said quietly. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whose dream I was renovating. Emily wiped away a tear before looking at me. "I cannot undo what happened." "No," I answered gently. "None of us can." She nodded slowly. "I should have asked. I should have waited. I should have respected that this was your home before I imagined it becoming ours." Her words did not erase the damage. They were never going to. But they sounded honest, and honesty was something our family had been missing for a very long time. Robert extended his hand toward me. "Mrs. Collins, I owe you an apology. I believed the paperwork before I knew the person." I shook his hand warmly. "You corrected your course as soon as the facts changed. That matters." One by one, the workers quietly packed their tools. Trucks rolled away from the driveway. The endless noise that had greeted me that morning slowly disappeared, replaced once again by the distant rhythm of waves meeting the shore. As the last construction trailer pulled away, the house looked wounded but strangely peaceful. It reminded me of someone recovering after a difficult surgery. Healing would take time, but healing had finally begun. Laura stood beside me on the porch as the evening sun settled over the Atlantic. "There is one more appointment I scheduled for tomorrow morning," she said. I looked at her. "What appointment?" She smiled gently. "The restoration architect Arthur selected years ago. He kept detailed notes explaining exactly how he hoped this house would be preserved someday. I think you deserve to see what he left behind before anyone lays a single new board." The next morning, the beach house was quieter than it had been in months. The trucks were gone. The tools had disappeared. Even the dust seemed to settle differently, as though the house itself had finally been allowed to breathe again. I stood on the back porch with a warm cup of coffee wrapped between my hands while the first light of sunrise stretched across the Atlantic. For the first time since arriving, I could hear the waves without another sound trying to drown them out. It reminded me why Arthur and I had fallen in love with this place all those years ago. Peace had always lived here. We had simply forgotten how to listen for it. Laura arrived just after 8 carrying another folder, but this time there was no urgency in her steps. Beside her walked a gentleman in his 70s wearing worn leather work boots and carrying a weathered notebook tucked beneath his arm. "Margaret," Laura said with a smile, "this is Thomas Green. He is the restoration architect Arthur chose years ago." Thomas extended his hand. "Your husband asked me to promise something. He said that if anyone ever repaired this house after he was gone, they should restore its story, not erase it." He opened the notebook carefully. Every page contained sketches, measurements, handwritten notes, and small photographs Arthur had taken during the original construction nearly 3 decades earlier. There were drawings of the breakfast nook, detailed measurements of the bookshelves he had built with his own hands, and even a note beside the bay window that read, "Morning light belongs here. Never cover it." I smiled through tears that no longer came from sadness alone. "He planned all of this?" Thomas nodded. "Every detail. He knew houses survive because people remember why they were built." We spent the morning walking slowly from room to room. Thomas pointed to places where original wood could still be saved. Robert Hayes joined us for part of the inspection, quietly taking notes without interrupting. Before leaving, he handed me a folder. "Our company has withdrawn every disputed invoice connected to this project. We will cooperate fully with the legal review." We also accepted responsibility for not verifying ownership more carefully. I thanked him sincerely. Accountability spoken without excuses carries its own dignity. Over the following weeks, the legal process moved forward exactly as Laura had predicted. The forged communications, altered contact information, and unauthorized approvals were documented through the proper channels. The construction contracts were formally canceled, and the remaining financial issues were resolved according to the law. No dramatic courtroom scenes followed, no shouting, no public humiliation. Only quiet consequences flowing naturally from choices that should never have been made. Daniel visited me several times while the restoration slowly began. At first, our conversations were awkward. We spent more time watching the ocean than speaking. One afternoon, he brought a small wooden box. "I found this in our attic," he said. Inside were dozens of photographs I had believed were lost forever. Arthur teaching Daniel to fish. Birthday parties on the porch. Christmas mornings with sand instead of snow. Daniel looked at one picture for a long time before speaking. "I spent so many years thinking inheritance meant receiving something one day. Dad was trying to teach me that inheritance begins with how we treat people today." I rested my hand gently on his. "Your father would be proud that you finally understand the difference." Emily came several days later. She stood nervously on the porch, holding a small potted hydrangea. "I know flowers cannot repair trust," she said softly. "Neither can apologies by themselves. But I wanted to begin somewhere." I invited her inside. We talked for nearly 2 hours. She admitted that her excitement about creating the perfect family home had slowly become entitlement without her realizing it. She confessed that each small compromise had felt harmless until she could no longer recognize the line she had crossed. I listened more than I spoke. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not pretending nothing happened. It is refusing to let pain become the architect of your future. We rebuilt our relationship carefully, one honest conversation at a time. Some things returned, others changed forever. Both were acceptable. By early autumn, the house looked remarkably familiar again. Arthur's bookshelves stood where they had always belonged. The breakfast nook overlooked the water exactly as he designed it. The bay window welcomed the morning sun without obstruction. Thomas had preserved every pencil mark recording Daniel's childhood height by carefully framing that section of the wall behind clear, protective glass. "History deserves to be seen," he told me. On my first evening alone after the restoration was complete, I carried Arthur's old wooden chair onto the porch. I placed the brass compass beside my coffee mug and slipped the little brass key back into my pocket where it had rested for so many years. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, unchanged by everything our family had endured. I finally understood that the greatest victory was never proving that I owned this house. The greatest victory was remembering that I never needed anyone else's permission to protect what mattered most. If you have ever found yourself becoming invisible inside your own family, I hope you remember this. Kindness is a beautiful gift, but healthy boundaries protect that gift from becoming expectation. Your voice matters. Your choices matter. Your home, your memories, and your dignity deserve the same respect you so willingly offer others. Never confuse love with surrender, because real love never asks you to disappear. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you considered liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who may need this reminder today. Sometimes the strongest people are simply the ones who quietly decide they will no longer be overlooked. Thank you for spending your time with me and for walking this journey beside me. Until our paths cross again in another story, may your home be filled with peace, your heart remain steady, and may you always remember that self-respect is the foundation upon which every lasting family must be built.